Awesome. Okay. So that Zoom. All right. Welcome, friends, to the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. I am your host, Emily Clickhorn. This podcast is for mamas navigating childhood trauma while also walking through mamahood. Together, we will empower each other to connect with who we were created to be versus who we were told to be in our trauma. I'm so excited that you've decided to take some time out of your day to tune in and listen to the conversation. Let's dive in, shall we? Today, I am welcoming Sarah Roller to the podcast. Sarah is a financial coach who is passionate about helping new parents get a handle on their finances so they're not, grasping at straws. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here, Emily.
Awesome. So let's just get started, Sarah, by having you share a bit of your story and how you came to be a financial coach focusing on new parents.
Yep. Well, so this is a classic pandemic pivot for me. I was always, I would say, good with personal finances. I found it really fascinating. So it was just something that I gravitated towards. And it wasn't until I saw a lot of my peers really struggling with it, especially kind of getting to that like 30-year milestone, and that, okay, I'll sign up for, in the US, we have 401ks, but signing up for the workplace retirement, I'll do that when I'm older. And okay, we're not that young anymore. And I just really saw people around me struggling with it. So that really kind of sparked an interest, not so much in the financial advisor wealth management side of it, but more the nuts and bolts, the things that we typically are not taught in school and often not taught by our parents. And then in parenthood, all of those things just get exponentially harder. It's so much harder when you have your priorities go from, you have a few things that are important, pre-kids, but once you have a kid, everything is so important. The stakes feel so high. It's really hard to figure out what to prioritize. There's so many late night Amazon purchases. Hopefully this will be the miracle thing to get the kid to sleep. So if you haven't got those nuts and bolts, that foundation really solid going into parenthood, this stage is just so hard, especially with, all the added costs, the daycare costs. It's just really hard. And I feel like some of the advice that I've seen out there is a little flat. It kind of doesn't always resonate with just how hard this life stage is. There are so many factors that you need to take into consideration. So I love being able to work with parents kind of one-on-one and really just help them navigate making decisions that feel right for them, their family, their values, what works for them, their personality, their strengths and weaknesses. Really just build the future that they want, but also being able to enjoy the stage of life that they're in right now.
Yeah, because I think for so many with young kids, we get so focused on meeting the needs, the financial needs, all of the expectations that are on us, that we sometimes forget to be present in the moment with our kids. And we miss out on a lot of those developmental milestones because we're so busy with everything else. So what are some of the, let's go with three. What are three of the biggest stumbling blocks that you see with your clients?
So I am a huge advocate of tracking your spending in some capacity. For some people, that's, writing it down every day, writing everything you spent. I think that's probably unrealistic for most people, but having some way to monitor where your money is going. that doesn't necessarily need to be a lifelong thing. Although for me, I've been tracking it for over a decade and I love that data. But just to be able to see, where is your money going? Does that reflect, first of all, what you even realize? I think a lot of times it isn't until we see a list of where our money went that we realize, oh, wow, I go to, whether it's Starbucks, Target, whatever it is, I go there a lot. I didn't realize I was spending that much money. And that's not to say, like, I'm really, not coming at this from like a shameful perspective, but just kind of seeing what your behaviors are and does that fit what your priorities are right now? And then also seeing what you are not spending money on. Sometimes, we have a lot of, again, with the mindless Amazon purchases, and then we say, I can't afford, insert something that feels like a little bit indulgent. I see a lot of clients who would love to hire like a house cleaner and feel like that's unrealistic. People like me don't pay for that. That feels frivolous. I could do it myself. And yet they spend more than that in impulse purchases, at Target or Amazon or something like that. And so just getting clear on where your money is going, does that fit, what you want in your life? So I think that's a huge thing. I think, yeah. Figuring out what your values are, which I know is kind of a, sometimes it feels like an awkward exercise, but just getting really clear, you as an individual, as a family, what is most important to you? I think for a lot of us, we look to our peers, our friends.
Bear with me, friends. Our Zoom has frozen, so bear with me. Just while we're figuring this out, I'm going to give you a few of my thoughts on tracking your spending. So this is something that I personally have struggled with because of the money mindset that I got when I was growing up. So for me personally, budgeting in my brain meant that we didn't have enough. Welcome back, friend.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. And so when I started tracking my income, I had to really shift my mindset and remember that it's not so much that we are in scarcity or lack or not enough, but we are being mindful of where we're spending our money. So that's a mindset thing that I personally have had to work towards. And I think that is in part because of my experiences growing up with trauma and all of that stuff in my background, because your trauma does not just affect one area of your life. It's like a sticky spider. It goes everywhere. So as you were saying, Sarah.
Yes, absolutely. And going back to the idea of it not being shameful, like we're going to indulge in some treats from time to time. Like we're not always going to make perfect, ideal decisions in every situation, but seeing like which indulgences, which splurges are adding a lot of value to your life and which are just that brief dopamine hit and then we forget about it. Because it is
or convenience.
Exactly.
Sheer convenience. They're not adding anything other than, okay, now I don't have to cook.
Yeah. And sometimes that can be good if you are
fun.
looking at your values and you decide that what we really need is more time as a family and there is something I can outsource and I have the room in my budget, or I will, take the room from somewhere else that's adding less value. If convenience buys something that is really important to us, then great, do that, but do that as an intentional decision rather than I'm exhausted, which I should have known I was going to be exhausted because I'm exhausted every night. So yeah, just being more intentional and, as you said, mindful, I think is a really good word for that. But yeah, I was saying, talking about your values, I think is a really important point as well. And just really figuring out where does it make sense to spend more money, and where do you not care as much about, that for some people, not spending as much on hair and makeup and clothes, like, okay, I can be a little bit more frugal there if it means I can, go on more adventures with my kids. Or maybe it's the opposite for you, whatever it might be, but just getting clear on what is important to you, what's adding value to you and your family. I think I cut out as I was saying it before, but I think a lot of times we look to external ideas of who we should be, especially with this new identity of motherhood. We're looking at social media and our peers, and sometimes we just model what we're seeing, even though that's not what's important to us.
And it's not the everyday realistic view of the lives of the influencers that we're watching and living after.
Exactly. But yeah, so getting clear on
all the time.
Yeah, getting clear on which, and maybe some elements of that, you're like, I love that and I really want that, and I am willing to sacrifice elsewhere to prioritize that, but just making sure that it is your active decision, or you as a family unit. And then the other thing that I think is really important is getting clear on what your long-term goals are. And I know that that's a hard concept, especially you mentioned before, we are so stuck in the moment to moment. It's really hard to think about where are we going. And not that you need to have a super concrete 5, 10, 30-year plan, but just to have an idea of, I talk with a lot of couples and I often ask them, what is your retirement vision? And I am consistently surprised how many couples have never had that conversation. I work with a lot of very open, communicative couples, and they've never had that conversation. They have a vision in their head that's built by either what was modeled for them, what media projects for them, but they've never talked about it with their partner. So, they could find that their partner is envisioning selling their house and moving to the beach, whereas they're thinking, oh, I thought we were going to work until we die. But just getting clear on what are we working towards, I think makes it a lot easier to kind of keep that long-term path in mind, but also it helps get partners on the same page. I think, again, with partners, we often are focused on the immediate, the short term, the day to day, and that tends to be very nitpicky and negative. Whereas if we can focus on a shared vision, it makes it so much easier and so much more enjoyable to have a more positive relationship around what are we building with our money as it pertains to our family.
Well, yeah, even now, my husband and I will have conversations where I'm asking him, are you happy with the life that we're building right now? And if the answer is no, that's fine. But what steps can we take to move in the right direction? What steps can we take to kind of shift our trajectory and go in the direction that we want? If something is not serving us, then how are we going to shift and make the life that we really want? And I think it's huge to be doing this now while our kids are 4 and 3. That's huge. And it's not the norm.
Yeah. And sometimes, I'm not a huge proponent of extreme sacrifice or anything like that, but sometimes knowing this just isn't. Another thing that comes up a lot is travel. Sometimes knowing that this just might not be the season for us of big trips, but we know that we want to be the family that takes our kids on international vacations at some point. Maybe at 4 and 6, you're kind of maybe tiptoeing to where that might be more feasible and not so miserable. But knowing, especially when you've got really small kids, that okay, we're implementing whatever other steps so that we'll be in the position to do that. We are foregoing, whether it's, indulging in some of the toys or needing to do all of the classes or something like that, or whatever it might be, active decisions you're making so that we can, have this future that is important to us.
Yeah. Because I mean, if we're solely focused on muddling through the schedules and pleasing everybody else's expectations, and we don't have some sort of a forward view, it can get kind of depressing because it's so monotonous and it feels like it's never going to end. But we have such a finite amount of time with small children. Eventually, they're going to grow up and they're not going to want to spend as much time at home with mommy and daddy. And that's what happens. They're not going to always be in diapers that cost extraordinarily exuberant, like huge amounts of money. And formula and all of that stuff that does impact your budget. So what are some steps that you often have your clients do to get a handle on their finances?
So, I mean, I talked earlier about tracking your spending. I think that's kind of the baby step towards building a budget. When I say the word budget, I know it kind of irks some people. It is kind of thought of as similar to the word diet. It is very restriction focused, and I don't love that. The way I approach budgeting is much more kind of like projecting what your spending is going to be, and we do our best to try to hit it. And if we don't, we look at why. Was there a specific reason? Could we have anticipated that? What did we learn from not hitting the budget last month in order to be better planning next month? Is that we tried? I see a lot of people trying to be super restrictive, like month one in a budget, and that never works. We need to take baby steps. We get 10% better, 10% better over time, rather than I'm just not going to spend on clothes at all this month if that was something you spent a lot on in the past. So yeah, taking kind of small steps to see where you're spending, where you want to be spending. You were talking earlier about, the kind of how depressing it can be to just be like muddling through. I think a lot of times when things feel really hard, they feel really tight, we tend to rely on coping mechanisms like the impulse buys, the daily Starbucks or coffee in general gets picked on a lot. So I don't mean to, dump on that, but we kind of rely on these little treats to keep us going. But if we have a goal that we're working towards, it's a lot easier to say no in that moment if it's for something specific. I am going to put the money I was going to spend on that into a separate savings account that we're doing, we're saving towards a vacation this summer, instead of just, no, I need to save. I need to save is super boring and unmotivating, but I am saving for insert something super specific. Yeah, that is really helpful. So I tell a lot of people creating a savings bucket, which is just a separate savings account that you have for a specific goal, is a really good way to save for something specific, stay motivated towards it. You can, with most banks, you can actually like give your account a nickname. So you might give it the name Mexico. You might give it the name Margaritas on the Beach. Transferring that $5 to Margaritas on the Beach is a lot more motivating than just saving. So getting specific with what you're saving for, but then also trying to anticipate the unexpected expenses. I see a lot of people who, I feel like I'm doing pretty well, but there's just always something that pops up every month. And the reality is there is always something. Sometimes it's totally unexpected and we can't predict it, but most of the time there is some kind of regularity and pattern to it. It could be an annual bill that you just forgot about. So with a little foresight and planning, we can think, okay, when are those annual bills coming up? Let's not get so surprised by them. Okay, Christmas is coming up. We always spend money on that. Let's think about, how we're going to plan for that. Vacations, going to wedding, whatever it might be. These things, most of them tend to be fairly predictable. But when they're irregular, they're hard to plan for if you're not thinking a little bit more long-term.
Yeah. Yeah. I have found that giving my savings accounts nicknames and a particular purpose has been so much more motivating and um, inspiring because I want that thing than just a savings account.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like it's amazing how when you give something a particular purpose, how much more your motivation is increased. It's huge.
Mhm. And I think a lot of it goes back to kind of what was modeled for us in childhood and whether we come from more of a scarcity or an abundance mindset. I've seen a lot of people who the idea of putting money into a separate savings account feels like it is money being taken away from them. Like it is no longer theirs. It is no longer available to spend, even though it's going into a savings account with their name on it that is going to be spent on whatever fun thing they had planned for it. It just feels like it's being taken away from them. So really just kind of understanding that it is your money. You still get to decide what to do with it. You are just deciding something for future you, not for today you.
Yeah, it becomes less about instant gratification and more about the delayed gratification and working
Exactly.
towards that thing.
Yeah.
What tips or tricks or advice do you have for our listeners who maybe are looking to get a handle on their finances and they're feeling the tightness, especially with dreaded inflation and all of this stuff that is just crazy. What advice do you have for those people who are just getting started?
So I think first, for some people, just looking, if just opening your bank statements sends you into a sweat, first of all, know that that is not abnormal. That is the case for a lot of people. But getting an understanding of what your overall financial picture is and getting clear on that is really helpful. The official term is looking at what your net worth is, which is basically your assets, what you have, what you own, what's in your bank accounts, minus your liabilities, what your debts are, whether that's mortgage, car loan, student loan, credit card loans, and just understanding, okay, how does that all shake out? Do I have more in the bank than what I owe? Do I have less? For if that's not something that you currently know, that is helpful, a really helpful starting point. For some people, just doing that, it ends up being not as bad as they thought. And for other people, they learn that, oh, I didn't realize I had this much in, let's say, credit card debt or whatever that is. But I think for a lot of people, we have this like internalized feeling of what our financial situation is, and it's not necessarily based on reality. So I think, first of all, just making sure that what you're reacting to is real and not just an internalized feeling. And then from there, as I've said, tracking your spending to see where your money is going. Are you cash flow positive or negative, which basically just means, are you bringing in more than you're spending or are you bringing in less than you're spending? And figuring out, okay, if you're spending more than you bring in, what are, from there, you got to figure out, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to look to reduce expenses? Are you going to look for ways to increase income? Obviously, that's not an easy task, especially as a sleep deprived parent. But understanding kind of what that situation is, again, going back to what is the reality for you, I think is a really critical first step.
Yeah. And I just want to add that as you're going through all of this stuff and you're figuring out your financial landscape and tracking your spending, your income, all of that stuff, to do it with curiosity and not judgment.
Absolutely.
Like if you're approaching this and you're thinking, well, of course I'm in the red because I'm a horrible person and I don't know how to manage money, and I'm never going to get out of debt. Stop and reframe some of those thoughts, because what you think and what you believe is what you create. So going at it with curiosity, well, why do I have that habit of spending $25 every week on drive-through of whatever your preference is? What is that giving me? Can I make some changes to lower that number if it's not a necessity?
Yes. Two thoughts that I had from that. One is we are looking at your starting point, like going forward. I think looking back retroactively is often not that helpful. So yeah, this is where we're starting at today and where we're going to move forward from. So not fixating too much on how you got there. That being said, so I don't want to necessarily get critical of the decisions that have been made, the behaviors that you've had in the past, but you kind of touched on the why those decisions. So whatever, if you feel like you made some mistakes in the past, let's not get too stressed about them, but let's think about why they happened and what we can either do differently, or just, really explore, if you have that pattern of, some expenses that are not adding a ton of value. Why did that happen? What itch were they scratching? What need? What are they, a coping mechanism for something? And honestly, a lot of spending is a coping mechanism for something. Figuring out what that is, sometimes that's a perfectly valid thing to do. And other times it's a really expensive, not that beneficial coping mechanism that could be, swapped to something else. But understanding the why behind it. But not fixating on the fact that it happened.
Yeah. Why is a very powerful question.
Yeah. And I like that. Get curious. I have a Post-it note that says get curious, just as a reminder in life, because I think that's a really helpful way to approach things.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts or anything else you want to add?
I think just really kind of trying to not look at it from a perspective of shame. Money is hard. It is not something that most of us were taught. It's not something that you're just going to intuitively know for most people. It's a taboo subject. So often, even within homes, we aren't, given the benefit of seeing what our parents did, whether that's learning from their mistakes or learning, I work with a lot of clients who had very successful parents and they just didn't teach their kids how to implement that. So one, don't be too hard on yourself. But two, I am a huge proponent of being open and learning to be more comfortable talking about money. As a parent, I think it is such a gift to be able to have open dialogues with your kids about money. So yeah, if nothing else, as a goal to get to a point where you can talk about it. You don't have to be perfect with your money to talk about it with your kids. You can tell them, hey, I've struggled with this, but I'm learning. And that gives it such a good perspective that if you realize you made a mistake, you can go back and, let them know that you have a different perspective on it now. But yeah, I think getting to a point where you feel comfortable talking to your kids about it, because they are absorbing everything that you are doing. A lot of our kind of money perspectives are fairly formed by the age of 8, which is terrifying. As a parent of a 6-year-old, we are approaching that point. That's not to say that it is completely solidified, but they've kind of absorbed how they think money works in the world for the most part by that point. So just trying to, give them opportunities to interact with money and give them some insight into how you're making decisions, I think is a really helpful thing for parents.
Yeah. Where can people connect with you if they want to connect with you further?
Yeah, so my website is sarahroller.com. I am working on a new freebie download that is helping people kind of anticipate those unexpected expenses, just kind of a calendar of all of the unexpected expenses that tend to pop up. So that should be live hopefully early July, if anyone wants to come check that out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and we will talk soon. Bye-bye,
Thanks,
friends.
Emily. Bye.